Hello, for today's lesson I'm going to briefly, and I mean very briefly, cover the vast history of the United States and touch upon the type of government that can be found in the United States of America. And that will be the lesson for today's flipped geography class. America was able to fill its borders from people coming over from other countries, and we call this immigration. This brings us into migration, which is the movement of people within the United States, and this also played a large role in looking at the diversity of people who live in the United States today. If you recall, our first settlers in this land mass were the nomads that came over the land bridge from Siberia. Those people came 13,000 years ago and remained here basically untouched until exploration became so large in the 15th century. During this time, the Spanish were the first people to come, and they explored and discovered the southeast and southwest. And discovered is a very loose term because we know that there was people here before them in the US. What they came over to find was gold and other treasures. The people to come after them were the French and the English, and they settled on the eastern coast, giving us our original 13 colonies. This settlement of people in the 13 colonies didn't only affect those who came over on the ships, it also affected trade between the New World and Europe. One way we can look at this affected trade is through the Columbian Exchange, and you can see that on this diagram. On the diagram, you can see that many goods and crops were traded from the United States to Europe, and they would in turn receive items from Europe and West Africa. As you can also see on the diagram, not everything we got was good, because the Europeans often brought over smallpox and other diseases that the Native Americans had not yet grown an immunity to. As the colonies got bigger, so did the British Parliament's control over them. The British Parliament claimed at one point to protect the colonies from the French, as they were involved in the French and Indian War. Because that French and Indian War took place in the colony's territory, they claimed that they lost a lot of money, and the only way they could raise that back is if they taxed the colonists. The colonists didn't think that this was fair, though, because they didn't have any representation in the parliament. So if you think about it today, us here in Iowa have representation in our government in Washington, D.C., through the Senate and the House of Representatives. At that time, they did not have any say in their government over them, which was Parliament in Britain. And so they didn't think it was fair for a government to tax them when they really had no one to represent them in that government. The British were taxing things such as paper and tea, and that led to a lot of dissension in the colonies because we had the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Massacre was when the British troops came over to make sure that we were not smuggling in tea and other goods, and that led to a skirmish outside the Boston Customs House in downtown Boston. The Tea Party was when they taxed the tea, and we went and threw all the tea into the harbor. It was a group of colonists who dressed as Native Americans. All this dissension that was really centered in Boston led to our Continental Congress, who was representing the colonists, declaring war on the British. And as you know, the colonists ended up winning the Revolutionary War. After gaining our independence from the British, a man named Thomas Jefferson decided it was appropriate to expand our borders, and he purchased Louisiana Territory, and today we call that the Louisiana Purchase. This territory was an area of land between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. Thomas Jefferson bought this land for $15 million, and this land freed up the frontier, which is free open land that is available for people to move into and expand their territory. Over time, we saw the U.S. get into many conflicts, both between our own people and with other nations. Examples of these types of conflicts between ourselves is the Civil War, which you know happened between the North and the South, the Civil Rights Movement, which was between the blacks and the whites, and the feminist movement, which was started by women. Conflicts also arose between us and other areas of the world. Examples of this were World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and the Cold War. As the US moved toward the 20th century, we can see a huge shift in technology and lifestyle of people. People quickly traded in city life for different setting in suburbs. Suburbs are communities located just outside of cities. Because of an increase in technology, there was also a huge economic boom that solidified the United States as a major economic power. After flying through the brief history of the United States, I want to quickly touch on the government we have here. In the United States, we have a thing called a representative democracy. In a representative democracy, people rule through representatives. For example, in Iowa, we have 2 senators and 5 representatives that work for us, and they represent us in our government in Washington, D.C. Alongside the representative democracy, we also have a federal republic, which means that our powers are divided among the national and the state governments. Another important concept to understand in our government is that we have 3 branches, and we also have a system called checks and balances. This system was put into place so that the government never got too much power. And we wanted to make sure that didn't happen because in our government it is divided up between the states and the government, national government, and the people. So no one couldn't get too much power. This diagram shows how the 3 branches are split up and what their different responsibilities are. We have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Okay, the legislative branch, or the Congress, is the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we can see that they approve presidential nominations and controls the budget. So they're checking the executive branch. The executive branch, or the president, he can veto things that the Congress pass. So those two check and balance each other. The president nominates judges, which make up the judicial branch. The judicial branch can declare the president acts as unconstitutional, so there's checks and balances here. The judicial branch can declare laws unconstitutional, and the legislative branch makes the laws, and the Senate confirms the president's nominations of judges, so there's a checks and balance there. I know that this was a really quick introduction into the United States history, but I didn't want to go into too much detail because you will take a whole class on U.S. history and a whole class on government. So as we go on, we will look at other countries and see what type of history they have, and we'll look at their government as well, and we can come back and compare them to the United States.